When the Computer History Museum in Mountain View invited the press to a sneak preview of its 25,000 square foot, $19 million renovation, I jumped at the chance. The facility will house one of the world's largest collections of vintage computers. The tour is guided by Apple co-founder Steve Wozniak. Steve is one of 52 fellows at the museum and was asked to handpick 8 items on display. On January 13, the museum will open its doors to the public. But for now, we will have to contend with work in progress, with many objects wrapped in protective plastic, and the usual jostle of an eager press. I'm here with John Haller, the CEO of the Computer Museum here. And Mr. Haller, what's the significance of having a computer museum?
Think about things that have had the most impact on our lives that are man-made. Computing is among the most important. It's completely revolutionized life. There are more transistors in the world now than there are printed characters on every printed page in every language. So that is a really profound thing that has come about in a very short amount of time. Something that has been that influential and so pervasive in our lives deserves to be studied. It's here to stay. And more importantly, almost every innovation in computing has happened in a very important social and historical context. It can be computing during wartime. It can be computing that's helped build businesses. It can be computing that has launched spaceships or predicted the weather. And it can be as simple as the computer on your desktop or in your pocket. That is just a sweeping story, and the people who have been responsible for it are also people whose stories are worth telling.
I think your words are particularly relevant because I noticed right behind you have an abacus.
That's right.
We've come a long way.
We have come a long way since the days of the abacus. And in fact, if you think about it, it's the handheld to the handheld. You've got an abacus in one hand and a smartphone in the other, and that represents about 2,000 years of technology.
Mm-hmm. I understand that Steve Wozniak is going to be giving us a tour of the place, and so I really look forward to that.
Steve's a remarkable person. First, he was a great engineer. Second, he was an important co-founder of the most recognizable, most valuable brand in the world now, in Apple. But he's also important because Steve he's transcending all of those things, and he's now becoming a kind of statesman and ambassador for technology and its impact, and for engineering and computing as a career. And he talks very eloquently about what it means to be a young engineer, to have great ideas, and he's a very good friend to the museum, so we're always glad to have him back.
Yeah, well, thank you. And now for the ambassador for high tech, Woz.
County is one of 10 counties in the United States where more than half of the people speak non-English at home. That's because the computer industry attracted them here. And Santa Clara County is the only county in California that you can get married secretly and nobody has access to the documents. And nobody, I like knowing little trivia bits. So all these people, as we walk through the museum, curators, they know the little tiny bits that really make the stuff interesting, that don't necessarily have to do with its meaning to humans, as a development of a technology, but they really make it, part of a museum should bring out those little tidbits of interesting facts. Okay? So as I said, I'm not a historian, but I can certainly talk about my personal experiences. Every bit of equipment in here, obviously, stories going from the big to the small and the simple to the complex, and the galleries. What I really admire about the galleries of this New Revolution exhibit is that they connect a lot of the phases of computing and types of computing, actually draw the connections between them. And that's one of the most amazing walkthroughs. I've been around this museum for a long time. And you walk in as a technician, you see, you just stare at the equipment and goggle, and how did they think of doing that, and stuff I've read about or used, and it's amazing. But when you actually go through in this new environment, it's so beautifully attired. You can tell it's beautiful when you can't find the doors. And it's like a real museum that normal people that don't know what the equipment is will walk through and actually get some good learning. And this is going to be a big attraction to the Computer History Museum. So glad that this is a great, and this exhibit, of course, was sponsored by people like Bill Gates, who put up the funding and deserves a lot of credit for that. And then a few young people, people like myself that really care just about, doing good things for society, donated their own equipment in here. Al Alcorn donated the Pong prototype, and Lee Felsenstein early computer equipment that he designed for some of the starting companies. And those people deserve just as much, they're doing just as much with what they have as even people that put up big money. But it all takes, a lot of caring about where we came from to cause an exhibit like this to take place and exist.
You're at the airport.
Revolution.
Are you guys all set?
All set.
All right, here we go.
Yeah.
Still, and of course, you see the guys on TV who can beat calculators with advocacy. So, that's always been a part of this museum. It's not one of the things I'm talking personally about.
And so this area will feature calculators from more than 2,000 years total. From slide rules through early attempts at doing Napier's bones, things like Pascaline, and mechanical calculators like occurred here.
Some of these devices, too, they figured out ways that you can actually twiddle things around, do calculus on physical devices in the early days. These are really historic items.
And you can see a wonderful graphic of a table abacus. I believe that's from England in 1300. All right.
Our area.
This is the Hollerith machine used in the 1890 census. And one of the most important machines that really introduced automatic counting, basically, to the world. This used in the 1890 census counted 60 million people and was actually the winner of a government contest to find a way to mechanize the census. Because you have to do it every 10 years, and the 1880 census had taken 7 years. So the 1890 census would have taken more than 10 constitutional crisis, big problems, and the winner. And of course, the Hollerith company combined with 3 others to form IBM. But Steve's going to talk about a couple machines over here.
Now, this one we go back, a lot of these machines predate my time zone. But when I started learning how to program, I sat down on a key puncher just like this, and typed your data in, a card would go through and punch holes. The data is in the holes. It's a computer concept, not a human concept. Human concepts are you write words. As you walked in the entry to this building, you actually walked over a floor that had punch card layouts, and they actually have meaningful information. I don't know what it is, but you can ask somebody. My new name card, I have a metal name card, and for my phone number, I actually used the Hollerith card. If you get up here, it's got columns of 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So it's got numbers, and I actually punch out the numbers on my business card to it's sort of symbolic of these machines. And we punch our cards up, get a program in the deck of cards, feed it into a reader. Don't see the reader right here. Feed into a reader, go into a computer. The computer would do the printout, and you get your answer back maybe 4 hours later. And that was how we did it when we started college. That was when Introduction to Computers was a graduate course. Even if you were a freshman, it was a graduate course in most colleges. And some of these machines here are sorters that you can actually program wires underneath and cause them to sort numbers a certain way. Just like today we take a database. We want to find a list of everybody who lives in Maine and is over 40 years old. That's what these machines can do it all on their own with no other computer. They were essentially minor computer database machines as they went. And this was the whole start for me. One of the little stories of interest that I pride myself on is at Berkeley. When I was taking programming courses, around finals time, you had to wait 40 minutes to get on one of these key punches to get your turn to punch a change in your program. You'd have to wait 40 minutes. Oh my gosh, it would be midnight, 1 a.m., 2 a.m. Well, I found over on the side they had a couple of other key punches. Most people were using the Model 19, and I used the Model 26. Nobody else used the Model 26 because it was for a different computer. But I discovered that if you touch type, all these special characters, like a left parentheses might be hold your left pinky down and use your middle finger and hit up near the E key at the same time. You'd even use the same hand for 2 button presses, but I knew how to do it on the key punches so well, I discovered it punched the same holes even though it printed the wrong characters. So I'd go to these unused machines, not having to wait 40 minutes. I'd punch out my programs this way, and it would read wrong on the text, but the holes were right, and the computer only knows holes, and that's what matters. So a lot of us screw up this way. You know what works and what matters. So let's move on.
Go this way, folks. This is our section about analog computing, and our next stop is right around here. So we'll go this way. Point out the giant machine Johnny-Ac, named after John von Neumann, one of the inventors of the computer. Also point out the Enigma machine. You may have heard of that. And our next stop is right over here. Okay. This is a very, very simple ancient contraption, and it's where I actually started with computers. The simplest computer logic circuit is a light switch. You turn it on, the light goes on. You turn it off. Very similar to that are these devices down here called relays. You're not seeing very many real electronic parts. You're basically seeing batteries, relays, and a couple lights. And this was an adder that could add 1 and 0, and it would get a 1. Or it could add a 0 and a 1 and get a 1. Or it could add a 0 and a 0 and get a 0. Or it could add a 1 and a 1 and it would get a 0 and a carry. Take that and you multiply it, put it side by side 10 times, you can add and subtract numbers up to 1,000. And that's basically the heart of computers. This was before vacuum tubes, before transistors, before chips. So way back in time, people were starting to play around with how could we make circuits do a little bit of work for us. And as large and expensive as it looks, we wouldn't have our iPhones today if we hadn't started with devices like this. My first science fair project, one of them that was huge, was it had like 92 switches for the natural elements, 92 lights for where electrons might pop up in orbits, and I used a lot of relays to make decisions inside about yes or no, which switch is on, which is off, which lights are already on. So that's a tribute to our early start and George Stibitz invented that. Feel free to get a couple of shots here and then we'll move on. George might be wrong. That's George. That's because it was George. Okay, because it was introduced to me by Stibitz was introduced to me by a guy named George also. Oh wow! So I'm more when I confuse them. Yeah. Okay. This is one of the most famous computers ever. This is the UNIVAC 1. And for a while in the 50s, UNIVAC was the word people used to mean computer. And this annoyed IBM greatly because there were people who would actually say things like, oh, did you hear that national lab or university got a new IBM UNIVAC system? And, you know, branding like that would really annoy IBM. We'll move on here. This is going to be the section for early computer companies. And this is on real-time computing. And this is a model of one computer. This is a model of a Sage installation. And Sage, which is this machine also behind me, was probably the largest computer ever built. There are 23 or 24 of these around the US and one up in North Ontario, Canada, one of those cities. But part of this was underground, and this whole bottom section would have been just power generation, air conditioning, and this top was all the processing power. So this is a huge, huge building. And as you can see here, this is probably maybe 0.5% of one installation. So you can just imagine how huge this machine would have been.
And an iPhone, of course, does 1,000,000 times more, and it does 1,000,000 times faster, and it costs 1,000,000 times less. And but what that tells you is, in our past, there were applications for computers that made an iPhone worth $1 trillion. And those applications caused these machines to be built, which took us on the path that led us to today's iPhone.
Better put than I ever could have done. Of course, every museum needs a Mercedes. And we go on to mainframes.
Whose is it?
That's actually ABS brakes, has automatic braking system. You can see there's the little case that has one of them in front of it. Of course, mainframes here. The IBM 360 is sort of the rock star computer of the 1960s. Hugely important and really gave IBM a nearly permanent grasp on the mainframe section.
And of course, even when you had this computer, you had to turn it on and turn on tape drives and turn on disk drives and turn on printers and everything. We had one of these at the Anza, and a friend of mine had it copied the key, so we'd sneak in at night. A computer at midnight should not go unused.
Yeah, does the Computer History Museum still have a rule that nothing newer than 10 years is in the museum?
It's a flexible, but that's a very important guideline to us.
Okay.
And of course, it's very important to show the artifacts that would have been used, the peripherals, the tape drives, the disk drives, that were actually been used with these machines, because really without them, you're very limited in what you can do. So that's an important part. So our next thing we're going to show you is the memory section, and Steve's going to talk about this thing that looks like it could be fermenting beer.
What we have here is I put back together a RAMAC disk drive. It was really the first hard disk drive under today's type of hard disk mechanisms. They had strange things like the head had to float above all these spinning cylinders. The multiple spinning cylinders were for parallelism, so you could have 5 megabytes of data in a small space. And the head that flew over it had a little forced air that kept it floating. A very different approach than what we use today, but it was the step that made it possible, and this took us a long way. This disk was designed in the city I was born in, San Jose, California, 99 Notre Dame Street. You can go down there. If you like the old spaghetti factory, it's across the street almost, and you can see the little plaque that commemorates it. So the start of hard disks was here in San Jose.
They were developed at IBM's research lab.
IBM. It was developed at IBM on 99 Notre Dame Street in San Jose.
Yeah.
Not the one in Almaden.
Yeah.
So this section here is also about mainframes, but it's also about time sharing, the ability to use for one person or for multiple people to use one computer. And so systems like this would have been used for airline reservations. This is a UNIVAC system that would have used one computer but had sometimes thousands of terminals all over the place.
And finally, they had a system where you could, before that, you'd go to get an airline reservation at an airport, and they wouldn't know how many tickets had been sold or which ones. They'd have to get on the phone and call people. Finally, we figured out we could hook computers together to do the job. In modern times, we figured out ways to make that not work. But and probably a lot of you remember having this sort of thing in your schools.
Yeah. Also, one of my favorite stories, the VAX 11780. Every Mervyn store had one of these up until about 1998. So this is also the first time-sharing system I ever personally used at the Computer Museum in Boston when I was there. Okay, we're going to go through here to supercomputing, and you've got to stop here.
Well, the time-sharing exhibit was all about expensive hardware that many people could share at the same time to make the value go out. The Cray was more about a personal computer that one person at a time would use, run programs on, but to have extremely high speed that was needed to solve certain kinds of applications in the world. And Seymour Cray got earlier experience at CDC. We're going to visit one of his machines right over here. Now, at 2 of the universities I attended, including Berkeley, at Berkeley we had this model of Cray computer, CDC computer, the CDC 6600, and you can see that, all that wiring that's done on the back, that wasn't offshored in those days. These computers were built right here, so it's an immense amount of effort and work that went into these large machines. To have something like a few video screens that could give a little information to the computer operators was unbelievably expensive back then, but this was pretty much the most expensive computer in the world. I think back then it would probably cost, tens of millions of dollars in today's dollars. So it was very expensive. One of the things that Seymour Cray pioneered was making computers extremely fast. That's why they're called supercomputers. Today, the supercomputers of the world are measured by which ones are the fastest, can do the most calculations per second. And this was certainly one of the champions in its time zone, in its time, and the largest version of this, so a large version of the CDC 6600 was operated at Stanford Linear Accelerator Center for all the physicists to calculate the effects of atomic collisions in the early days of exploring that level of physics, quantum physics. But to get high speed, parts heat up. So Cray was very famous, especially in the Cray computers, for liquid cooling, pumping liquids into the chips and arranging. It was more of a hardware design, a plumbing design, than the electronics that made it work. And although the electronics is fantastic, the wires are actually measured for their distance, and how long the signals will travel on them was a big part of the design of these early supercomputers. So, and this one, when I programmed it, one thing I discovered was you have architecture. Many different buildings can have different flavors. A museum looks like a museum, it feels like a museum. Computers had sort of a rough von Neumann architecture similar to other machines we visited so far. This machine, when I got to program it in college, even though it was only graduate courses and I was an undergraduate, I got to see, oh my gosh, they have very strange things. You move a little bit of data into one register, and whatever address that is, it moves another register out to that address. It's like you got multiple things happening for the shortest number of steps. And I came to admire so much computers that were designed around shorter steps along the way that electrons have to flow to get things done, makes those operations faster. And it's called RISC architecture now, but it was just amazing to see that people thought of things that were so different than all the other computers of the time. So different than the way IBM did things with very complicated instructions that could tell the computer to do very complicated things. This had the very simplest instructions, but they executed so fast that in the end it was a faster computer.
Yeah. Okay, so get a couple shots there.
Can I get your mic?
Sure.
Pause for miking.
Hello. Yeah, I'm talking. You hear me?
Yeah, no,
Okay.
it's not working.
Oh, darn.
That's all right.
It's all right.
Ambient.
We have
Oh, man. Technology. I always say the people who invented these things should be killed.
Yes.
Okay, we're going to come this way. And as we walk past this, one of the things I love about working here is there are things that you can tell that people actually touched. And this was actually built by Seymour Cray. So, you know, it's like, you know, he's the closest thing to a rock star, other than Woz, of course, that we have in computing. And, you know, this is something that he actually fiddled with and made himself. So, I love it.
My heart, when I saw this, my heart just skipped a beat when I heard that story, that he actually hand-wired it himself. And, geez, it's just amazing, you know, when a pioneer actually did it himself with his own hands. These days it's like somebody did the coding.
We're headed into mini computers. We're in that section next to that red thing. As we walk over to our next stop, I want to talk about one little machine here. This is a PDP-8E mini computer by Digital Equipment Corporation, who played a very important part in founding the museum. The original museum founded as part of Digital Equipment. But this is actually used at Mass General Hospital to perform brain surgeries. Before that, you had to keep your patient awake while you were doing the surgeries. And this allowed actually impulses to be measured in the brain, and so they could be unconscious. So, you know, computers directly affecting people through surgery. Just, to me, that's the entire story of computing, that just, you know, how it affects us. But Steve's going to talk about a machine over here that I sadly did not unwrap.
Now, when I was in high school, I accidentally stumbled upon a manual that described the architecture of that PDP-8 over there. It was a manual called the Small Computer Handbook. And I opened it up, and it described really how a real computer that was made and sold worked. First time in my life I discovered such a thing, and really inspired me to say, wow, I wonder if I could teach myself how to design these things. There were no books, nothing on computers. So what I did was I found a way to get the manuals for all the mini computers when there were no stores that sold such things. What I would do is go to Stanford Linear Accelerator Center on Sundays with a friend, and we'd drive in thinking nobody's there. And these smart people that work there, they always leave doors unlocked. So we'd always get into the main building that had a library, and I'd go to the library and read computer magazines that you could never find in normal magazine stores, and there were little cards you could fill out and order the manuals for almost all the mini computers you see here. I would order their manuals. When they came home, I'd go in my little room at home, shut the door, nobody knew I did this. No friends, no parents, no teachers, and I would just start to design with chips, the chips that were available in those days. How many chips could I make this computer in? Try to get better and better and better. Just competed with myself. The Data General Nova was introduced. The whole computer fit on one board of chips. And chips, you know, basically chips are, you know, $1 each. They're sort of inexpensive. Back then, though, a chip could cost as much as $50. But this computer had a different architecture internally. It's like if you imagine a building that has a very different architecture, and whoa, than all the other computers around here. Very different than the CDC 6600, but really strange. So when I sat down to design my version of it, Woo, it took half as many chips. It turns out that the architecture had been designed around the chips that were available. And it became important to me to cross the disciplines. If you want to do an excellent job, cross the disciplines of being a designer of an architecture should also know the components it's being built with. The designer of a building should know the lumber and the different parts and mechanical assemblies and what is the least, and then be wanting to make the trade-off. What is the absolute least I can use and get the same result? This computer was just as fast as the others, half as many chips as all the other mini computers around here. And I discovered the reason, and it influenced my life so much. I told my father before I was out of high school, I'm going to own a 4K Data General Nova someday, because 4K is enough that I could type my programs in like I used to do with punch cards. And of course I'd have to buy a teletype, costs as much as a car. And my dad said, how are you going to do it? It costs as much as a house? And I said, I was stunned. I didn't realize that was the cost. And I said, I'll live in an apartment. I was going to have a computer someday, this particular computer, and that drive hung with me. Funny thing is, there were other people around the country. There were hundreds, thousands of us who did the same thing. They said, someday I want to have my own computer at home that I can sit down and program and nobody can tell me what I can and can't do with it. So this Data General really changed my life. When I was in high school, I had posters on the wall that came from the company of two versions of this computer. One looked like this, and the other looked like a little desktop computer over here that was an inspiration for today's personal computers. In my mind, all of a sudden, I had this idea. This was a computer sold by Neiman Marcus for doing menus. And numbers, you get a programming course, cost $10,000, a lot in today's money, a lot more in today's money, I mean. And you bring up little code numbers that told you what items to use and how much to use of them, so it really wasn't as good a recipe as using a book. But the shape of it said, oh my gosh, a computer could actually look like something that you'd see in a home, like a fancy car. And that image stuck with me so much. Well, they had, the Data General Nova was in one of these sort of shapes on a glass table, and I had that poster on my wall in high school, and always wanted somehow to bring things home to this scale.
The Apple II looks like it was influenced a lot by this design, was it?
I don't think so, but I couldn't say for sure. In other words, I didn't remember a specific design that closely. But I just wanted to get some. The Apple II was sort of like a typewriter. I'd say the Selectric was more of the model for the Apple II. Apple I and II. Apple I and II. Yeah.
It's also had one of the rather telling 1960s advertisement slogans, "If only she can cook as well as Honeywell can compute." Mad Men at Work. We're going to go over here into Digital Logic, all about processors, and Steve's going to talk about one of our machines here.